Running from Saul. In our last story, we learned how David and Jonathan made promises to one another. Jonathan would protect David from Saul, and David would show favor and love to Jonathan and his family for all his days. Jonathan learned that Saul's hatred for David still burned hot, so he warned David. David fled to the wilderness. In this story, we will learn how David continues to flee and visits Ahimelech, is given Goliath's sword, and then in Gath pretends to be crazy in front of Achish, as inspired by the book of 1 Samuel. David's chest was about to burst. Heavy rain fell, and lightning filled the skies with light. David's heart was racing, and his lungs couldn't gasp fast enough. He was completely exhausted. Running from Saul had cost him a great deal of energy. David needed food. David stumbled to Nob near the temple, and Ahimelech the priest came out to greet him. Ahimelech was afraid to see David, for he knew he was one of Saul's commanders. "Why are you here alone?" Ahimelech asked. David was overcome with hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. Out of angst, David lied to Ahimelech, saying, "The king sent me on an important mission. I have an appointment with a young man here in Nob. Please, give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you have here." The priest shook his head and said, "Sadly, I only have the holy bread meant for ceremony. Only the priests and men who have kept themselves from women are allowed to eat it." David regained his composure and spoke with less desperation in his voice, saying, "Whenever I or my men are on expedition, we are kept from women. We are truly worthy of the bread." David acted as though he was with a whole team of people to get more bread. The priest, not wanting to question David's authority, took the bread off of the altar and gave it to David. "Do you have any weapons?" David asked. "The king's business required I leave immediately, so I did not bring any sword or spear." The priest's eyes lit up. He said nothing and beckoned David inside. The temple was warm and dry. David held the bread close to his chest, still feeling a slight sting of guilt as he carried it. The priest led David into a room. There was a figure on a table wrapped in cloth. The priest took it in his hands and began to unwrap it. A beautiful sword glistened in the candlelight. The priest lifted it up and gave it to David. He held it in his hands. It was a large sword, but felt familiar to David. The priest smiled and said, "This is the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you defeated in battle. It is the only weapon we have here." David's heart began to flutter as he held the sword he once used to cut the giant's head off. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Not long had passed before Saul caught wind of where David was. So, in a hurry, David fled to Gath to escape. Gath was the homeland of Goliath and Philistine country. David, afraid and alone, ventured into enemy territory with Goliath's sword sheathed on his side. Achish, the king of Gath, was perplexed by David's arrival. The people of Gath had thought all along that David was the king of Israel. This meant David was in more danger than he realized. Achish's servants brought David in. So David, in an attempt to save himself, began to act insane. He marked his chambers with odd symbols and drooled all over himself. Achish was perturbed by his servants bringing David in. "Do you think I need more madmen in my home?" So he had David depart from his presence. David departed immediately from Gath and escaped to a cave in Adullam. David wallowed in the loneliness of the cave, crying out to God in his distress. There he wrote songs to God. In the darkness he questioned God, praised God, and loved God. It was not long before David's family discovered where he was. They came to him and ministered to him. Shortly after, many men from Israel began to flock to David. Men who were outcasts, debtors, and bitter found hope in the presence of David. 400 men stood in front of David, following his every command and hanging on every word. This was David's new flock, a flock of misfits and social outcasts. Broken were given purpose under David's command. This would be a foreshadowing of the Christ to come hundreds of years later. David and his men dwelled in the land of Moab for a short while, and then departed to the forests of Judah. There David and his men became close, and their strength and numbers grew day by day. Saul was told of David's new community, and how 400 unruly men followed him everywhere he went. All of a sudden, David was an even bigger threat to Saul. He became furious with his servants that they had allowed his whereabouts to go unreported for so long. More so, he was outraged with Jonathan, who had made a covenant with David. Saul raged in his throne room. One of his servants then told him that David was given the sword of Goliath by Ahimelech. This caused Saul to pause. Saul said nothing. His eyes were glazed over in rage. He gathered his things and his men, and they departed to Nob to find Ahimelech. Saul burst open the temple doors where Ahimelech and the priests of Nob served. The priests cowered in fear as Saul approached them with his armed men. Saul's face was red, and his eyes were piercing. Saul walked among the priests, pointing his sword at Ahimelech. The priest was trembling as Saul's sword lightly touched his robes. "Hear me, priest," Saul spoke with silent rage. "Why have you conspired against me and armed David? You clothed him, fed him, and gave him a weapon of great importance." Ahimelech could barely speak, he was so afraid. He managed to stutter out a few words, saying, "My lord, I thought David was one of your most faithful servants. He is your son-in-law and a captain over your army. I know very little of any dispute you have with him." Saul did not listen to the words of the priest. His rage had blinded his eyes and cut off his hearing. He turned to his men and said, "Kill them all." But his men did not move. To kill a priest over this would be an absolute sin, and these men would not budge. Saul yelled again, "Kill them!" But the men did not move. So Saul turned to his trusted servant Doeg, who then killed 85 priests and their families. The priestly town of Nob was painted red with Saul's jealousy. At this moment Saul was completely given over to sin's hold over his mind. One of the sons of Ahimelech escaped the bloodshed and fled to the forest where David and his men lived. David's heart was tied in knots over the news. He felt responsible for their deaths, since he had sought refuge there and lied to Ahimelech. David's self-preservation had caused the needless slaughter of priests. David anguished over this and protected Ahimelech's son.